we are here to provide an overview of the Surplus Land Act and answer any questions that you may have about HCD's authority and authorities under the SLA. So first off, what is the purpose of the Surplus Land Act? The purpose of the Surplus Land Act is, there are many purposes. One is to provide more affordable housing in all areas of the state. One factor that drives the cost of housing is the lack of available land. The Surplus Land Act, as amended in 2019 by AB 1486, makes surplus land available to, first to entities that build affordable housing. The Surplus Land Act applies to local agencies, including cities and counties, as well as other agencies such as districts. Among other things, the SLA requires local governments, cities, counties, transportation districts, etc., to make their surplus land available for affordable housing. And we've had some great success. As of just a few days ago, HCD has received 467 exempt surplus land declarations and 180 full dispositions. The overwhelming majority of the dispositions that we receive are. And the SLA is helping to create housing. This is like the favorite slide here, is to show how much housing is being produced as a result of the Surplus Land Act. From those approved dispositions that I mentioned in the previous slide, close to 7,000 housing units have been proposed, 4,700 of which would be affordable. There are two processes for the Surplus Land Act that I'll get into in a future slide, but you can see the number of breakdown of how those units are coming to fruition through the exemption process and the standard process of the Surplus Land Act. So these homes are helping local jurisdictions and the state meet housing goals. So here's the fun part. Here's your exclusive sneak peek into the bureaucracy, the process of the Surplus Land Act. There are 6 steps. The first step is to declare the land surplus at a city council, board of supervisors, or district board of directors meeting. This is done through adopting a resolution declaring that the property is surplus and no longer necessary for the agency's use. Step 2, before disposing of the property, local governments are required to notify that the land is available by issuing a notice of availability for at least 60 days. That NOA must be issued to 2 different categories of housing developers. The first are housing sponsors that have expressed interest in surplus property. These are housing developers that are certified by the California Housing Finance Agency, and they express their interest in surplus property by completing a survey on HCD's website. The other category are local public entities that have a jurisdiction that includes the property, and these are government entities that develop or operate housing for low or moderate income households and include tribal government. Step 3 is to negotiate in good faith with respondents for at least 90 days. Generally, the rule is to prioritize affordable housing. However, local agencies must prioritize parks and recreation on sites that are already being used for park and recreation. Step 4, report to HCD by sending disposition paperwork showing that you followed the steps of the SLA. Within 30 days, HCD will let the jurisdiction know if they have correctly followed the law or if they need to make any corrections. The local government or the local agency will need to place a covenant or deed restriction on the land for future use. If no responses are received to the notice of availability or no price and terms were reached with a respondent after good faith negotiations, the covenant or deed restriction must note that if the land is ever used to build 10 or more housing units, at least 15% of those units must be affordable. Step 5, and this is hopefully the step that actually your local agency would want to avoid. If HCD finds problems, a local agency has 60 days to address the findings and correct the issue. While HCD is prepared to provide technical assistance to help local agencies resolve issues, if a local agency does not correct the issues that HCD has identified, there are potential penalties. These can be 30% of the final sales price in the first case of violation and up to 50% for a subsequent violation. And then the last step is to dispose of the land. It's important to note that the SLA does not prohibit the local agency from disposing of their property for fair market value. I think it's also important to note that the SLA doesn't prohibit the local agency from disposing of property for less than fair market. So now that we've gone through the standard Surplus Land Act process, I mentioned that there's also the exemptions from the standard SLA process, and we'll go over those. There are 14 official exemptions to the Surplus Land Act, but they're grouped into 4 rough categories. The first category is the grandfathering exemption. This is for deals that were entered into and completed by a certain date or properties identified in a long-range plan. The second kind of category is streamlining for properties already being used for affordable housing. The third category is for other public uses. So this would be, again, the land restricted for uses such as park and rec, agency use, land exchange for another property the agency needs, land transferred to another agency, or surplus land owned by school district. And then the last category of exemptions is land that's unlikely to be developed for affordable housing. And this is defined in statute for the Surplus Land Act as, lots that are smaller than 5,000 or 10,000 square feet that are sold to a contiguous property owner, land that was once a street, right of way, or easement, legally restricted land, in other words, land that has restrictions that prohibit housing that cannot be mitigated. And so those are the four exemption processes provided by the Surplus Land Act. And then the other cases that lie outside the scope of the Surplus Land Act, besides those 14 official exemptions, are cases where the Surplus Land Act does not apply. And this includes short-term leases, land leases that are for a term of less than 5 years, and leases that do not allow for demolition or development of the property. In these cases, the governing board does not have to pass a resolution to declare the land as surplus or exempt surplus. And I guess just this is a kind of a good reminder that outside of these 2 cases, whether the land is being declared surplus or exempt surplus, the local agency does have to make that declaration at a public meeting. So here are some tips for local agencies on how to comply with the Surplus Land Act. One is to develop in-house familiarity. We have guidelines, dense reading, but it's a lot easier to read than statute. And we are actually currently in the process of updating those guidelines and providing more clarity to the guidelines. Another tip is to survey and catalog potential surplus properties, and then have a general sense of whether or how the Surplus Land Act applies to those properties. And then lastly, gather any information, documents, reach out to HCD to confirm the understanding of the Surplus Land Act applicability to a property, and understand the process. And HCD, like we're here today, we are here to help. We're glad to provide these presentations and provide technical assistance. We're here to answer questions. We have developed and continue to develop information materials. We provide legal analysis, and we provide trainings like these to demystify the Surplus Land Act and proactively address concerns and questions. Here is a glimpse at some of the resources that we have available. As I mentioned, we have guidelines that are currently on the website and available for viewing. We're in the process of updating those guidelines, and that will be taking place over the next couple of months, and we'll hope to have some draft guidelines out for public review and comment very soon. And we also have a version of this Surplus Land Act 101 PowerPoint on the website, frequently asked questions document, and exemption user guide. You can also see on our website a map of the notices of availability that we have received, and a list of developers interested in surplus property. You can see a sample notice of availability and covenant or deed restriction forms and a compliance self-assessment tool. If you have questions, if you want to learn more about Surplus Land Act, you can reach me and the Surplus Land Act team at publiclands@hcd.ca.gov. And to report potential violations, please email compliancereview@hcd.ca.gov. And with that, I think that's all I'm recording.
Thank you, Laura. I expect we'll have some questions for you, but we first need to proceed with public comment.
Again, to raise your hand, to speak, select the raise your hand button or input *9. When I let you know it is your turn to speak, unmute yourself by either selecting the unmute button or by inputting *6. We currently have no speakers in the queue.
Thank you. I'll now turn it over to the committee members for questions and comments. Please raise your hand and I'll let you know when it's your turn to speak. Jack McGrory.
Yeah, it's a couple of questions. If we, if the city wants to redevelop its own property, that does not trigger the SLA, right?
Seemingly simple question with a much more oh my gosh, why can I not say this right? It's much more complicated than that, basically. It kind of depends on, what will be happening with the property. It will depend on if the property or the redevelopment qualifies for one of those exemptions, or if it will go through the standard process. So I'd say, I guess, unless it meets those two criteria of a short-term lease or a lease that doesn't provide for demolition or development, either way, the property will have to either go through the standard Surplus Land Act process or the exempt Surplus Land Act process. And my colleague Matt Manuel is on as well. He can answer if there's any further clarification on that question.
Thanks, Laura. The question that I would ask Jack is, are you disposing of the land? If the city plans to keep ownership and develop it itself by just bringing in a contractor, then that wouldn't be a disposition. But if you plan on selling or leasing the land for the purposes of developing the property, then you would trigger the Surplus Land Act. So that would be the deciding factor.
Okay, I got it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike Zucchet.
Thank you. So, I mean, in shorthand, the purpose of this is to ensure that surplus lands, produce the highest number of affordable housing units on it. I mean, that's what's behind this legislation and this whole process, correct?
The Surplus Land Act is primarily actually a process law, and it really kind of more than anything is a right of first refusal, providing the opportunity for affordable housing developers to have the right of first refusal to an available property. Where the question of affordable housing units and number of affordable, an affordability level of those units come into play is if a property is going through the standard Surplus Land Act process, has issued a notice of availability, has received multiple responses to that notice of availability that propose affordable housing. That would be where the question of highest number of units and levels of affordability would come into question.
So fair enough, but assuming we have multiple bidders, essentially the bidder who's going to be successful is the one who proposes the most affordable units.
Matt, do you want to hit this? It's never as straightforward as we would think, right?
It's only as straightforward as the legislature made it, Mike. So the unusual term that appears in the surplus land is that local agencies must give, quote, first priority to the entity that proposes the most units of affordable housing. Unfortunately, the phrase first priority is not synonymous with shall. If the legislature had used the word shall, then we would have interpreted it the way that you are right now. Unfortunately, the word first priority doesn't appear anywhere else in statute, but we have not interpreted that to be an absolute dictate that you must award the bid to the person or the entity that has the most affordable units. What we do ask is that if you choose somebody other than the entity that proposed the most units of affordable housing, that you write us a letter explaining why you did choose them. So the cities and counties maintain some discretion over the bid process.
Okay. And thank you, that's helpful. And so for the purposes of defining affordable units, is it strictly 80% AMI and below, or do you consider, or does the act contemplate workforce housing, and or is it just 80% AMI?
Yes, what the statute does is reference the health and safety code, and the health and safety code sets it at 80% AMI or lower. But nothing over 80% AMI will qualify as a quote affordable unit under the Surplus Land Act.
And I suppose that could be something, going back to your previous answer, that a jurisdiction could say, well, you know, this bidder had X affordable units and this bidder had X -5, but they're also producing, you know, however many, you know, market rate, you know, 80 to 100% units, and that's why we went with that. And that would be something that could be consistent with what you're talking about.
Absolutely. You know, we've received several letters from other local agencies that say, you know, this builder proposed 80 units of 80% or less, but all else market. And these people offered 75 units, but they also agreed to do another 80 units at 90% of AMI. And we're like, okay, you've offered a acceptable rationale for not going with the most. So the discretion does exist.
And sorry, last question, sorry to ask so many, but could another reasonable rationale be, you know, how these units are paid for? In other words, if one developer is proposing a certain number of units that are going to be financed with vouchers and tax credits, but another one is producing units that are paid for with the, you know, profits from the for-profit portion of the project, thereby, you know, leaving vouchers and tax credits for others, and actually producing new units. Could that be another rationale as to why you would choose one or another that's not strictly on just how many units?
Well, I will say that HCD has not developed a definitive list of rationales that do qualify and that don't qualify. However, I can tell you that the city of San Diego came to us and asked, would financial viability of the project be a legitimate rationale to pick one bidder over the other? And we responded, yes. So we have allowed local agencies to look at the way in which builders will finance their project, either through tax credits or some other process, as an acceptable rationale.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Donna Jones?
Thank you. Similar to Michael, I don't know if this is something that you could think about for your update to the guidelines, or if it has to be addressed through this rationale process. But I would love to see the guidelines updated to say that it's not just the number of units, but you can also look at the bedrooms, because you could have someone that has some 2 and 3 bedrooms where you have actually more space for people, but fewer unit numbers than someone else that has more 1-bedroom unit. So is that something that you could put in the update, or does it have to be relegated to a rationale?
That is our guidelines guru. He is leading our guidelines update process. So I'll turn it over to Matt to respond to that question.
And I appreciate the feedback as we are going through that review and update process. I can tell you that we have allowed that rationale in the past. So there's already precedent for that. If a community comes to us and says, this builder offered 10 units of studios at affordable, but this person offered 5 units and they're all 5-bedroom houses, and so therefore we went with them because that's 25 actual living units. We have accepted that as a legitimate rationale. So the precedent does exist. We just haven't stated that explicitly in the guidelines, and I am working on that. So I will put that on the list of feedback to discuss internally with our attorneys and staff. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I have one other question, and maybe I should have read the exemptions section myself before asking, which I didn't, and I can do that later. But just curious, when you're going through the exemptions, does the city using the property for a city hall, is that a public use that would count as an exemption, or is it only? Yes. Okay.
Yeah, so long as the property in its entirety will be used for the agency's use, then it does qualify for the agency exemption.
And is that, when you say property in its entirety, what if you have multiple separate parcels that are maybe contiguous, maybe a little near one another, but so like, for example, you have 5 parcels that are all kind of part of a big project. Could you just kind of exclude the one property, the one parcel that's only City Hall, and then address the Surplus Lands Act with whatever you're disposing that you're going to have other uses for?
We review FLA disposition by parcel. So if that helps to answer the question.
Yeah. Okay,
Like,
great. Thank you.
Parcel that would be used for the agency use would be examined separately from the other parcels that might be disposed of. I mean, for the purposes of whether those ones would have to go through the standard process or qualify for an exemption.
Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Bill Ponder.
Yeah, I just have just a technical question. Everything I saw that was being presented was 2019. Weren't there changes in 2021, or have those been incorporated into the information that you provided?
Matt, there might have been some legislation in 2021. I don't think it's significant as 2019.
Yeah. So, Bill, there were some small adjustments in 2020. They specifically focused on the North Metro Transit project and changed some grandfathering dates. And there are about 6 or 7 bills that work their way through the legislature this year that would make some very minor changes to the Surplus Land Act. So far, 3 of them have been signed by the governor. I believe some are headed to his desk, but we don't know if they'll sign or veto. But in general, I can tell you that these are changes around the margins that do not really affect the PowerPoint presentation that Laura presented. They're very technical changes.
Okay, thanks.
Julie Corrales.
Hi, a couple of quick questions. So there's the standard process and there's the exemption process. I'm assuming the exemption process is swifter, and that would be for public uses, as Donna mentioned, and also if it's 100% affordable. Is that right? If all the units are affordable?
100% affordable or mixed use. There are a couple. Matt, do you recall the various?
Yeah, there are 3 exemptions that you can use for based on affordability. You know, F1 and 2 do require there to be at least 300 units, so it's rarely used. The most common exemption used for affordability is 54221 F1A, and you are bound to provide 40% affordability for that one. And as a previous speaker mentioned, I believe it was Mike, 40% at 80% AMI or lower.
Thank you, Matt. And just to clarify, Matt is referencing the government code of the Surplus Land Act to start the state statute. If anybody was curious what 54221 F1A, we all rambled up nothing, but for everyone else who's not in the Surplus Land Act statute every day, that's what that is.
Thank you. And then I guess my next question is for the city. Sorry if this is already been addressed, but so the city is in fact planning to get rid of the land. Is there any intent, or is it being entertained that the city keeps the land and leases it But wait, that would also be, would that also be SLA? Because it's not a short-term lease. Got it. Okay.
Maybe I'll
Got
take that one. Yes, the city does plan on probably leasing the land. And some of these questions I think are very germane to what we're going to be going through and some of the decision process as to, do we carve out a parcel or two because it's going to be for public redevelopment? Like, tearing down a city hall to build a new city hall type of thing, or do we incorporate all that into the Surplus Land Act and have a third party come in here and rebuild? And those are some of the things I'm going to look towards this committee to maybe suggest, as well as the city council.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Stephen Russell?
Yes. First of all, let me just thank HCD for sending its very best here to brief us on this very important topic. We really appreciate having this knowledge at the beginning of this process, and having you in particular, Ms. Nunn, to provide it. My question is really kind of following up on the question about how we evaluate the most affordability. Clarified that we could count the number of bedrooms as an alternate to simply counting the number of units. I would guess then that we similarly have discretion if we are providing a much deeper level of affordability, say 30% AMI, or the new category 15% AMI and below. Could that then be considered as equal number of units, but this is at 30% AMI, given preferential treatment over something, say at 80% AMI?
I'll let Matt answer that one, but I think again, it's the written findings support that. But Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, Laura's absolutely correct. So because the legislature did not provide us a lot of guidance about what first priority meant, we found ourselves, writing on a tabula rasa, blank slate here. But yes, we're looking for a reasonable rationale that seems to be sincere about providing the best product rather than simply avoiding affordable housing. And so if a local agency comes to us and says, look, this wasn't the most units, but look, these folks were offering 30% AMI opposed to 80% AMI, that's a rational reason to choose that bidder over someone else. And in that case, we're relatively deferential to the city's process.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer Luce?
Hi, I'm just curious. I know that this particular visioning project has a lot of complicated elements to it. And at what point in the process do we as a group understand which properties will fall under this designation versus which won't? Because I think it will affect the way we vision the whole. Just curious about that.
I think in my presentation, I kind of went over those tips for local agencies, and among them is that, kind of creating that list of your surplus or of your properties and which ones might, be subject to the Surplus Land Act. And so, in short, to Matthew's point earlier, if the land will be put up for sale or for lease, it's subject to the SLA. It will either follow the standard process or it will qualify for an exemption. And that part of that, and creating that in-house knowledge. And as you're looking at these properties for this project that you all are tasked with kind of guiding, it will be understanding, what each property, what the vision is for each of those properties, and whether or not you would need to go through the standard process or if that property would qualify for one of those 14 exemptions. And that's really kind of, if the property will be for sale or for lease, it will be subject to Surplus Land Act. It's just a question of which lane it's going to, fall into. If that answers the question. Okay.
So it doesn't have to be contiguous. How non-contiguous can it be? And the only reason why I'm asking is because the city council has listed a number of properties, and we've been really just looking at contiguous properties within the Civic core, and they've listed some that are not within that area. So is anything that could be considered SLA potential for review?
I think so. I
Might
guess
make
the answer
sense.
to your question is that we review dispositions by the parcel number, if that helps to answer the question. Contiguous or non-contiguous is kind of not really. I mean, it helps to inform in situation scenarios where you're doing kind of a big redevelopment. It informs how each parcel is planned for purposes of reviewing under Surplus Land Act, but really what matters is just the parcel number and what's being proposed on that. How,
Okay, I think.
Yeah, if I might maybe expand on Jamie's question. So we've got 6 blocks that are contiguous, which is really part of this project that we're talking about and this committee's focus. However, there may be another parcel that the city wants to declare surplus that's 6 blocks away. Can we throw that parcel within these other 6 parcels and do one NOA and let one proposer or one team ultimately win, you know, the 6 here and the one 6 blocks away and maybe another one that's 4 blocks away, all subject obviously to the Surplus Land Act, or do they all, or with the ones that are not contiguous have to be through a separate NOA process?
Yeah, and I'll let Matt, clarify it further, but when it comes to the notices of availability, there's also a pretty good deal of discretion at the local level as well as to what you put out in that notice of availability.
Right. Jay, I have processed dispositions that had notices of availability that listed 58 different properties and 58 different APNs. You just simply, the city is required to attach an Exhibit A to their resolution, right? That says all of the properties in Exhibit A are hereby declared surplus. And then when you issue your NOA, you say, please see Exhibit A, and all of these properties are available for purchase. And there is no limit. I think I've actually seen some with even more than 58. So that's perfectly within the purview of the Surplus Land Act to do it as you described.
So those 58 perhaps were not all contiguous, is what you're saying.
And there is no requirement that property be contiguous in any way in the SLA. They can be unique properties all over the city.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. Lori Black.
There we go. Hi, this is my first meeting, and this may be more of a question for Jay or Jamie. So in a big giant vision, there's a state building, a federal building. There's been talk about those over the last 20 plus years. Nothing's been done. Does this project at all intersect or have a potential of combining with those to create something even better, what I have called consolidated resources, in other words, resources from the state, resources from the feds, to be able to create the kind of thing we would want in the core? Or is this just where City Hall is maintained on those blocks where Golden Hall and the other building is? And I guess, and a follow-up would be, and are there any discussions with the state and the feds about doing something together as opposed to creating factions of governments and municipalities doing their own thing without creating something a little more contiguous, if you will? It's probably a question for Jennifer as well, for creating something all together.
Well, maybe I'll kick it off. Obviously, the state has 2 blocks in the downtown area. They went through their own process, so we were not. We are part of it, that we could be an observer and provide our input, but without a vote. And they are far down the road on that one. There's no current discussion with any of the federal agencies that might have surplus property downtown. And I don't even know if they're subject to the Surplus Land Act. Federal government may not be. The state apparently wasn't. They make the rules and then they can apply them to themselves as they see fit. I mean, obviously their goal still is affordable housing. So whether they went through a formal Surplus Land Act process or something akin to it, they are going to get affordable housing out of that and some workforce housing out of that. This project and this committee was formed really to focus on the 6 blocks in the Civic core. I learned something new, which was different information than I was given before, that we might be able to also include other city property that's not contiguous to the Civic Center. And I think that's going to be fair game. As Jamie mentions, there were at least 3 council members in a memo that they released, asked for some additional parcels to be included. My first reaction based on information I had previously received was I don't think we can do that. Obviously we can. Which then may create greater value and may make the project much better. And I think if we want housing more located in some of these other parcels and more business operations, more centralized, I mean, that may give us more flexibility. I'm not saying that's the way to go or not to go. And then I think, and I'm going to cover this in the next item a little bit, is the ultimate decision besides is to decide which parcels we include. Do you include a city hall where it's probably going to be more expensive to have a third party build it, finance it, and then we're paying for it over time? Or does the city do it itself since it's a public works project and that becomes a policy call ultimately?
Thank you.
I can just add there, just on the question of like the state-owned land. So the Surplus Land Act applies to locally owned public land, but the state does have its own excess sites program that requires affordable, and that's the program that applies to state-owned land.
Thanks. I'm trying to keep an eye on time here, so why don't we go to one more and circle back with Jack?
Yeah. Jay, I guess I'm looking at this a little differently, that if you put out an NOA for these blocks, I mean, this is a very, very potentially valuable piece of property. And if we give the development rights, subject to the approval of the city to this project, we should expect, I would think, a significant contribution to the public facilities that need to be redeveloped on the property. I mean, that's the way I'm looking at this is, we should get a free city hall or a substantial contribution to a city hall and a civic theater as part of this. And that would be an expectation of this, because it's unusual to get 12, I don't know how many blocks we have, 12 blocks in a major downtown in the United States and not get significant either revenue or capital contribution back from this. And I guess the question is, if we send out an NOA, can under this Surplus Land Act, can we segmentize it so that we have, we can have 5 or 6, and if people can bid on all 5 or 6, or we can look at individual bids.
Well, to the first part of your question, then I may turn to HCD, but to the first part of your question, you and I are on the same page. There's going to be value, and there's going to be, whether it's in the ground lease or whatever, and how that revenue translates into a free city hall or a discounted city hall. We're going to maximize the value of the land as much as possible. So I didn't mean to suggest that we're going to have to pay for a city hall and then also give land away. It's however the cash flow works. So Jack, you and I are on the same page there in terms of the ultimate vision. In terms of if we do an NOA that has these 6 parcels and let's say 3 or 4 other parcels in there, and I maybe turn to HCD, can the city accept multiple teams because somebody might only propose on parcel A instead of the other 6 parcels, or is it an all or nothing by a team?
The Surplus Land Act is relatively quiet on the way in which the city negotiates and comes to a conclusion. It requires 90 days of good faith negotiations with any entity that responds to your NOA. Beyond that, if you want to dispose of the parcels, of 6 parcels to 6 different entities, that is fine. If you want to do 4 parcels to one entity and 2 to another, that's fine. If you want to have a master development agreement where one developer does the affordable housing and the other developer does the commercial buildings, that's fine. The only thing that binds the city is that to whomever you sell the project to, there is a 25% affordable housing requirement to anyone that purchases the property that responded to you in the first 60 days of the NOA.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Jack, and thank you, Laura and Matt, for joining us today. I'm sure we will be circling back with some questions throughout this process. Do you mind, oh, there you are. Do you mind sending us the PowerPoint? And are we able to post it on our public
Absolutely.
website?
Yes, I will send that over to Christopher. Please feel free. And again, a version of that PowerPoint is on HCD's public lands website as well. So if you're looking for it sooner than today, that's where you can find that.
Can you send your contact info too? Just so on other projects we can call you to ask questions?
Absolutely. And I have my own email address and so does Matt, but the easiest way, and this is just like, write it down, super easy to remember, publiclands@hcd.ca.gov. That is the inputs for our team. And if you reach out there, you will get all of us at all. But happy to provide my contact information as well.
Thanks.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
No motion is required as this is an information item only. We'll now take up the discussion agenda. We have one more item, which is city workforce needs.
The public comment period for this item is now open. If you have already joined the Zoom webinar online or by phone, please raise your hand if you wish to speak. Members of the public who wish to provide virtual testimony must enter the virtual queue by raising their hand before the queue closes. The queue will close when the last virtual speaker finishes speaking or 5 minutes after the queue has opened, whichever happens first. To raise your hand to speak, select the raise your hand button or press *9.
Thanks, Chris. Jay, please go ahead.
Thank you. And I'm going to try to share my screen, see if I can do that. Here we go. I assume people can see that.
Yes.
Yes.
It's not in presentation mode, but there you go.
There it is. Now it is. First of all, I thought this last conversation was extremely enlightening. And I will tell you, it was from HCD originally, not these two, who had indicated that they would frown heavily upon non-contiguous properties in fear of people playing games, other communities and so forth. So hearing that non-contiguous properties could be incorporated in an NOA is very encouraging. So anyways, and that would maybe open up a lot of the avenues for even this committee. I just want to cover, and it's going to be at a fairly high level, some of the space needs for the city. It's not refined to a finite number because there's a lot of variables that I'll walk you through a little bit that we are exploring and examining as it relates to our workforce in terms of teleworking, in terms of desk sharing, etc. But let me give you a little bit of an overview of what we've looked at in the past. Parts of this presentation was made to the City Council back in April. And I will tell you that when I go forward on the 17th of October, I'm going to use some of the same slides with some additional information in there. So these are the basically 6 blocks that we're talking about here, with basically block 1, 2, 3, and 4, if you can see the cursor, which is the Civic Center Plaza, Civic Core, Civic Center Plaza, King Chavez Community High School. This is a private building that is not part of city ownership. So something may or may not occur with that property. Obviously, we have City Hall and the Civic Theater. Over here is Golden Hall, the Concourse Building, and this is our parkade. Added to these 4 blocks is Cobb, which is our city operations building, which includes a fire station, as well as our development services department. And then, of course, 101 Ash, a building that we just acquired along with CCP, although CCP we have occupied for over 25 years, have roughly 800 employees in there and so forth. So these are the buildings. We engaged JLL to help us do some of the preliminary scoping. We will be using JLL to help us refine these numbers as we move forward. This is something that JLL had identified. Just an FYI, you know, we're obviously seeing, you're probably seeing it in your workforce, the attitudes of people wanting to work remotely, either 100%, part of the time, hybrid, and so forth. Different change from pre-COVID to post-COVID. So what was the analysis? And again, at a very high level, what we're trying to determine is how much office space do we need? How many buildings for a city hall and city workforce do we need within this complex? Can it be one 20 or 30-story building is, you know, versus multiple buildings? You know, which of these buildings do we need ultimately? And I think everything's open for discussion. But we're also recognizing that we have some downtown leases that also maybe we can pull some of those people into a city-owned building. So this is a breakdown of some of the data points. You can see under the total/averages, we have right now 796,000 square feet of office space under city control that we currently own, not even leasing. Almost half of that is 101 Ash, which, as everyone knows, is a vacant building right now. We're hoping that anybody who comes in as a developer would decide what to do with that building. Do they remediate it and make it into virtually a Class A, maybe a Class B plus building, or do they tear it down and maybe that's a good location for housing and so forth? No employees there. In this, we've got 1,768 employees, office space and so forth. You can see the breakouts there. I want to point out though, and this is something that we've had conversations with the city council in the past, the deferred maintenance and capital costs, just to sort of bring the building up to some level of modernization, repair, and so forth. Everyone's seen this number, this $115 million number for 101 Ash. That's a ballpark number, maybe a little bit less than that, but there's got to be remediation of asbestos, as well as possibly looking at some outdated systems or systems that have not been turned on for 5, 6, 7 years. When you flip the switch, will they work or not? But you can see in Civic Center Plaza, another building we just acquired, City Hall, and the city operation building. So all in all, if we were to retain the spaces we currently have and try to modernize them, clean them up, get rid of asbestos, whatever, over $260 million in potential expense. And then we're still left, I mean, unlike perhaps 101 Ash, none of these other buildings, I think, would ever become even a Class B type office building, given their age and lack of maintenance over the years. We also have some leased space that's downtown. And you can see that we're leasing about 130,000 square feet of office space for 655 employees. Can some of those employees end up in a new city hall as well? We know office space post-COVID is at a premium as more and more people demand less office space, less workspace because of teleworking, maybe desk sharing, and so forth. So that's going to be one of the decision points, and whether this committee can come up with some ideas or it comes out of the NOA process where a developer identifies that it would be better to build one tall building and put as many people in there. And I don't think at the end of the day, we're going to need space for both the 1,768 plus the 55, as everybody has their own cubicle or own office space. Not included in these numbers, obviously, are, offices that are not downtown, that maybe should be downtown. And of course, and we talked a little bit about this at the last meeting, are there offices that are downtown that may be cheaper and better to be relocated elsewhere outside of downtown area because they don't need to be physically down here? All of that, we're going to be working further with JLL to help refine these numbers. We're going to do employee surveys. The city just adopted a telework policy. We're working with each of the departments to come up with their sort of sub policy. It's fairly generic in nature, gives a lot of flexibility for the departments. And then, of course, the hoteling. Do we have quasi-assigned cubicles? Somebody takes it Monday, Wednesday, a different employee takes it Tuesday, Thursday, or do we go to a pure hoteling concept that you don't have the same workspace 2 days in a row? You come into work, you find an empty cubicle, you plug in your laptop, and you go from there. Obviously, all of these ultimate decisions will have to be worked through with our labor organizations through negotiations, because this would be a change in working conditions. And so we have, REOs, our employee organizations that, again, we'll be working with. But that's sort of the outside parameters of how much office space and how many employees are currently downtown. So as we move forward, this is what we're going to be working on, is the work styles, the seat sharing, or just having, freestanding workspaces, and how much space we're going to utilize for here. Also being able to build enough space to allow for, growth in the workforce. Don't want to build a new city hall and find out 2, 3, 5 years later we've outgrown it, and so forth. This is something JLL had put together, and this really is going to lead a lot of the decision-making process as to how much space you really need. And they broke them into basically 3 categories of the on-site, the more traditional 4 or 5 days a week in the office, to a hybrid, to somebody who works remote and comes into the office on an occasion. Maybe they come into the office when they have something going before the city council and they need to be physically present for the council presentation. They might as well work downtown. They need a place to plug in and work prior to or maybe after the council meeting before they head home. And so again, this is where we're going to start drilling down between now and when we probably won't have it before the NOA hits the street, but as proposals come in and we start negotiating with any development team or developer, we will be refining this information to be able to say, yes, we need X hundreds of thousands of square feet of office space. Obviously, we need a council chamber, etc., and so forth. This is to Lori's question earlier. This is the 2 state blocks that are currently under a development proposal. They've made a selection of a developer. It's the Michaels organization. They were talking at one point about possibly putting a city hall there. The decision now is to not partner with them for a city hall, but to have a city hall, probably on this footprint being within the civic core. It doesn't have to be physically where the current city hall is, but somewhere within this footprint, partially because we want to own the land and own the building ultimately. And this property is all going to be under a lease with the state of California. Basically $1 a year, but it's a lease, and we would not own the buildings that would ultimately be built here. So these are some of the things that are being looked at. Obviously, the majority of this is going to be affordable and or workforce housing with some market rate housing built into there. And so the kind of development we're doing, hopefully would dovetail with that. And here are some approaches. And clearly, when I go before the city council on the 17th, and you are all invited to participate in that meeting, it will be in person in the council chambers. They do provide for a hybrid if you do not want to come into City Hall. But one of the things I'm going to be asking the city council, not for anything definitive at this point in time, but ultimately for consideration is, and these are some of the questions you were all asking. We have 6 blocks right now. Do we only put 5 in the NOA? And forget the non-contiguous, because that would probably add to the numbers. I'm not saying forget it, that we're not going to include it. I'm just saying forget it for this part of the discussion. Just looking at the 6 blocks, do we want only 5 of them in the NOA because we want to redevelop City Hall ourselves, or do you want to include them all? And there's pros and cons on both. And trust me, I'm not going in with any preconceived ideas or limitations. And I'm looking for, the brain trust on this committee and other public input to help develop that strategy. And I'll be asking the city council similar, because I have heard from some council members, for an example, they want to redevelop 101 Ash. Don't tear it down. We redevelop it, make it into a good office building and so forth. Well, that may be one council member's idea, maybe multiple council members' ideas. Those are the inputs that we will think through. And then the ultimate plan for this will be, once we move forward with it, the intent would be either late December, well, they'll get in the holidays, so probably early January is when we will go to city council to actually declare whatever number of parcels surplus. Going back to Laura's presentation, going through the process, we'll go back to council, get them to declare the property surplus, probably in January-ish timeframe, assuming that this committee has completed most of its work and thought process, and then issue the NOA sometime before, let's say, the end of March of 2023, so in the first quarter of 2023, and then let it start running its process. With that, I'd be very happy to attempt to answer any questions you might have.
Thanks, Jay. I see a few hands are up, but we first need to proceed to public comment.
Again, to raise your hand to speak, select the raise your hand button or input *9. When I let you know it is your turn to speak, unmute yourself by either selecting the unmute button or by inputting *6.
I'm trying to figure out how to unshare now. Where is that? Oh, there we go. Stop sharing. There.
And we have 2 public comments. First is Chuck Kaminsky.
Good afternoon. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentation, Mr. Goldstone. I appreciate it. I think a key question for me that I hope will be addressed to the committee is, what is the staff projected growth? The current City Hall complex was built in the 60s, and we are obviously leasing space. So I would think as the city is growing, the need for services may change in terms of flexibility and adaptability besides work from home, co-share, et cetera. And also probably council districts will increase over time. So I think the growth projection, as well as the determination of what might be remote versus in place, I think is really critical, because that will determine how much of the available area may be used for government functions versus commercial versus affordable housing. So I hope that information is provided to the committee in a timely manner, so that before the end result of the committee's work is done, they at least can have an understanding of what projection of growth will be over, let's say, 25, even potentially 50 years. Thank you for that. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Kaminsky. We have Don.
2 points I'd like to make. I've always wondered, I worked at SDG&E for 23 years, many of those years in the one
I think we lost you for a second, Don. Go ahead.
Yes, I look out the window at the block east of 101 Ash, and it's a parking lot. And I always wondered, why hasn't somebody, the city or SDG&E or somebody, bought that lot and put it to a good use? And so I agree with Chuck that you have to figure out what your long-term staffing needs are going to be. And once you figure out what it is, then take a look at the adjoining blocks. You want to be aggressive. You're going to make a multi-billion-dollar investment in this. CCDC may end up with some money. You should look at those empty blocks surrounding the core you have now. Think about picking those up and make yourself a larger downtown footprint, new civic center. Second thing is, when I've been in every building in the county civic center for too many years to talk about. The only project, and I knew pretty much the story of the original concepts that Lloyd Rocco and some of the others, Sam Hamill, some of the other architects had for that project, and how those were cut back and then cut back and cut back to save money. And you ended up with a pedestrian box for a city administration building and a subpar convention center hall, which you then replaced with a multi-billion-dollar convention center Steve knows about. And the one part of that whole complex I thought that took my breath away, that was, I'll use the over-treaded word, the only world-class element to your existing civic center is the Rocco and Sam Hamill designed civic theater. And I'm sure most of you have been in that building for the opera or for other concerts.
Don, your time is up.
Yeah. Think about keeping that and making it a central element of a new civic center. Thank you.
That concludes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chuck and Don, for participating as part of public comments. I'll now turn it over to committee members for questions and comments, and we'll start with Jack McGrory.
Hey, Jay, those charts were fantastic. That's a lot of good information in a short span there. It's a great summary. You know, if anybody thinks we should save Ash Street as a building or a Civic Center Plaza or the crappiest city hall in the United States, you're on drugs, okay? It makes absolutely no sense. To try to save Ash Street with all the asbestos and all the internal problems it has, I don't get it. And I'm looking at your deferred maintenance costs. We have $250 million worth of deferred maintenance in those buildings. If you took that and capitalized it and built new buildings, you would have 420,000 square feet of new Class A buildings at $600 a square foot. I've been through this with the city council before. I'll just rehab something. And when you get into the rehab, you get into the guts of these old buildings, and it is just an endless pit of money. And 115 probably doesn't even begin to cover it. So I just think to think the council members really need to rethink this. We've made a complete disaster of Ash Street already. Let's get rid of the damn building and start from scratch, because you're not going to rehab that building. It's not. I mean, I've seen some of the studies on it, and it's not pretty. And the city hall is really the ugliest city hall in the United States. I mean, you can't get more lower class than what we got there. It is the worst case scenario. The council appropriated $15 million when I was city manager and said, okay, go up there and fix the sprinklers, because we found out that we didn't have sprinklers in that building. And I said, if I go up above in those ceilings, you're going to have more asbestos falling down on people than you've ever seen in your life. And I wouldn't spend the money. And nobody should spend a nickel on these three buildings. In this process, they all need to come down. I get a little bit of an opinion on that one. Hey, Jay, is the Emergency Operations Center still underneath Cobb?
Well, it is. However, the primary emergency operations center right now is over at Ridgehaven. So we have set that up at Ridgehaven.
Where's Ridgehaven?
Off of Balboa Avenue near the 15.
So that's empty space now?
Pretty much. I mean,
And
it's still available if we and ultimately needed it, but right now it's pretty much empty space.
Okay. I was never a big fan of what the county was doing when I was around, but I can just ask, they did a really good job with the Kearney Mesa campus they built. And I think we really ought to, before you go out with an NOA, make a quick study of how many employees, and in terms of customer service, how many people need to be downtown vis-a-vis building a campus like the county did, and how many people need to be downtown just because the city council needs to be there. That's, the heart and soul of the city. And I would guess you probably knock that seemed like almost 2,000 employees in half, and put them out in cheaper space as part of this whole process. And I was skeptical when they did that Kearney Mesa campus, but I think, for somebody who uses their services, accessibility and easy to get to and find people, it was really a good idea. And I think we need to really get aggressive about defining who's going to be downtown and who's going to be out in an offsite location. That's all.
Thank you, Jack. Stephen Russell.
So a few thoughts here. And one, I would counter Jack on the issue of should these things be far flung. I mean, we've definitely seen cultural issues in departments feeling very independent because they're literally not in the same building. So the city attorney, DSD, and in City Hall, there's a level of lack of responsiveness I sometimes found working at City Hall with departments that could have their fiefdoms even a little ways away. I don't know how it would be if we were far afield. CAB, I was actually fortunate enough to do the architectural design when we converted from 8 to 9 council offices. So I know the inside of this building altogether too well, and I would not work in it again. It's not good. The Civic Theater, as much as, if you really want to see what it should have been, look at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion that was completed almost at the identical time. A lot of the similar DNA, but we starved ours and they lavished attention on theirs. And so it is neither nor an opera house, music hall, nor a real theater because of the way they expanded the orchestra level seats in such a way that the first balcony is so far away from the stage, it fails most theatrical, that it just doesn't work. It doesn't work in many formats. So I don't think it's quite the gem. It has the intent. It was never funded properly. Most importantly of all this is I would hope that beyond the scope of what we're doing here, because I think, what we need to draw a line around our scope, is that we look at the opportunity to consolidate, for instance, what is happening on Arrow Drive with a lot of the temporary buildings. It used to be engineering, planning was there for a while. Could we free up those employees by bringing them downtown and free up places like Rose Canyon Operations Yard for more appropriate development? And I use that as one example of, I think there must be others in the city where prime locations like Rose Canyon are being used for storing vehicles when we're right next to a multi-billion-dollar trolley station. And so beyond the scope of what we're doing here, if you can look at, as we pull employees from other places, does it free up land to do some of those things? Choyas Yard is another one that comes to mind. So I would hope we would think larger. I don't want to expand our scope. I think we need to focus on downtown, but I would hope, Mr. Goldstone, that you would think about what other moves are freed up by allowing us to pull folks in and make other moves. Thank you.
Thank you. Martha Gilmer.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to talk about the Civic Theater and that it's not called out in these documents, and I wasn't at the first meeting, but it's a distinctly different project than obviously office space, and I completely agree. It is something that really deserves and demands our attention. It is antiquated and it wasn't designed properly in the beginning for comfort, for acoustics, for function. And while there was I understand there was a renovation proposal at one point, it's inadequate, I'm sure, and it hasn't happened. So just as we move forward to call that out as a separate entity, whether it's part of something as part of the leasehold, it's a requirement of the leasehold, or it's retained by the city and developed, I think that's really essential.
If I might respond to that, because we did talk a little bit about that the first meeting, and I don't think it came up in the HCD's presentation, but when we issue the NOA, ultimately, and let's just say we're talking about the 6 blocks, we could include all 6 blocks, but then put conditions and say that as part of the development condition, you must build a new city hall, you must build a new civic theater, or whatever. We're limited in what we can say you must do, but if there's some purpose that's already here on the property, our experience with HCD is they would most likely approve those as conditions versus if you add conditions that aren't currently here, because you may be taking away potential affordable housing units. So to your point, clearly, and we mentioned that the last time, that the Civic Theater, City Hall, a fire station, may be all three things that are conditions of any development that proposal that comes forward.
And like I can inform you of lots of civic performing arts spaces that are designed throughout the country that are real drivers in terms of, restaurants, people coming into the city, using the city more. And I think if we could really get a vibrant performing arts center on that site and the contiguous sites, it would be really dynamic for the city. So I'm here to advocate for that.
And Martha, Carol Wallace will be joining us at our November 14th meeting. So hopefully
Great.
that works for your calendar as well, because it'd be great to have you at that meeting.
I'd be happy to be.
Thank you. Mike Zuchet.
So just following up on the public speakers, Chuck and Don, and then my colleagues, Steve and Jack, I'm just, seems like this is just such a fundamental starting point. And Jay, I guess what I'm questioning, and I want to make sure I heard right, you were talking about, quote, refining these things in time for negotiations. It seems like this needs to be determined before we put it out to bid. These are huge fundamental directional decisions. We have 2,300 employees downtown right now. Is it the Steve Russell version of maybe that could be 3,000 or 4,000? Is it the Jack McGrory version of no, it should be the opposite? We should put people in cheaper office space and we only need 1,000 downtown. What's going on with what's the future of teleworking? I won't air my grievances now, but the city is very schizophrenic, even from department to department right now, as to who likes teleworking, who doesn't, who allows it, who doesn't. Especially in the basic construct of, I know we're doing a lot more here, but one of the things we talk about doing is, trading land to have somebody help build or build us a city hall. And I feel like we need to put much more meat on the bones as to what that looks like now before we attempt an NOA. Otherwise, we're going to let other people dream. And I guess my question is that this committee that's going to, make those recommendations? Jay, you were talking about you've engaged JLL. You're going to do an employee survey at some point. You're going to engage the REOs. Those are all things that take a lot of time. Is it gonna, I don't know, it just seems like this is like a huge thing that needs to be at least basically envisioned. It can always be refined later, but these are huge forks in the roads that needs to be clear with what we're asking for when we do the NOA, right?
I think when we're ultimately negotiating the NOA, yes, we need to have those answers, flushed out. Because for an example, what will happen is, and I'll draw the parallel with the Midway development. While we made the selection based on a whole set of criteria, affordable housing units being the primary or priority, the details in terms of lease payments, contributions, and so forth were not negotiated yet. That's what we're going to start doing. And coming up with a development agreement as to what can or cannot be developed. Obviously, there's a lot of other issues going on with the Midway area. I would envision similarly here, we know we're going to be including a new city hall within the NOA process. I think between today and the time we're probably ready to make a final selection and recommendation, which if you use the Midway process as a guide, could be 12 months from now, by the time you actually make the final selection and take that to City Hall for the team that you're going to then end up negotiating with. That's to me at least is when you need the more definitive answers of how many employees are going to be working downtown? What's the projected growth rate? I hear people loud and clear and so forth. What's the right configuration? Because that's when whomever is going to be selected would be starting sort of the design work on what a new city hall would look like, the components of it and so forth. So it's a little different, I think, in my mind than what you were suggesting. Yes, it would be great if we had every answer right up front, but I think there's enough flexibility through this process, as I would envision, that they can run on parallel tracks. At some point, they gotta converge.
So I just, for whatever it's worth, I just don't see it that way. I don't see these as details. There's just a huge difference between telling potential developers that we may need a city hall to house 1,000 employees or a city hall to hold 4,000 employees, or that they're going to be this hoteling concept or how many, square feet per space. I mean, those every last detail doesn't need to be worked out, but again, those are just giant forks in the road. And I don't know how and especially if we're going to have 6 to 12 months, I mean, that's really the city to vision what those broad strokes are going to look like, not for a developer to say, we think you should let everybody telecommute. Therefore, our proposal is, to have the city council and their staff in city hall and everybody else stays home. And that may be their vision. But anyway, I just think the city needs to figure out these bigger issues first.
Well, the city will be the one that's figuring these out. We're not going to let a developer tell us how our workforce should perform. Sort of the parallel was when we did the Midway redevelopment and we included a sports arena. And we did not dictate that the sports arena had to be X size, X number of seats. And we had a variety. We went down to maybe 8,000 to 10,000 seats up to 17,000 seat arena, and a lot of, and it's a little different. I get it because they're going to operate it and they're going to fill it and they're going to book the events and so forth. But it was still part of a process that was not predefined when the NOA hit the street.
Right. But forgive me for being argumentative and then I'll shut up. But that is letting the developer essentially select what the sports arena looks like. And that happened in this case because the city's not in the sports arena business, but the city is in the employment business, and housing those employees is part of what we're talking about here. And so I just think we have to put some corners on that for the bid.
Thank you. I see we're coming up on 5 and I'm happy to go past 5. I just wanted to keep mindful of time in case we start losing folks. And we have a few hands up. So I'll go to Jennifer Luce.
Hi there. Yeah, I'm a little concerned about this notion that we can't introduce new programming for fear of any restrictions. I think that could be the most visionary thing that we could do with this property, is to think about how to engage community, how to engage staff, city staff to be really excited about where they work, and how to bring city people to the site is probably adding more public-oriented or civic-oriented programming, whether it be a library annex or a community center or wherever it might be. If we're restricted on that, I'm concerned that we're just rebuilding the same as opposed to thinking beyond how we bring citizens to a civic space that they can all be proud of.
I think the vision for this committee is to think outside the box and what would be ideal. The potential constraint is what will HCD ultimately approve if we go through the Surplus Land Act. That's the issue. Now, if we do all this as public redevelopment, so to speak, as you heard, when we don't have to go through the Surplus Land Act, but the minute we declare some of the parcels surplus and we're going to lease it or sell it to third party, the Surplus Land Act gets triggered. And so it's just trying to manage the expectations. But hopefully this committee would come up with things, thinking outside the box, what would be an ideal scenario? And maybe if we include more parcels in it, in the NOA, and I can check with HCD on that. Can we say, put the housing over on these parcels because this 6 blocks could be reimagined in such a way that maybe not housing as much as other things to be the catalyst, and then housing a few blocks away or other things, and still satisfy HCD's and the state's priorities.
Thanks. That's great.
Thanks, Jennifer. Jack?
Yeah, I just think, Jay, I'm following up on what Michael Zucchet said, and that is, I think we have to define a minimum program for these people for the bidders to come in with. And I think if you leave it too wide open, particularly in a project this big, we're not going to get what we want, or you're going to end up in a really long, detailed negotiation process. Even with a defined program in Mission Valley for San Diego State, it took me 18 months to get through the city with a 55% vote. And we had a defined program. If you don't have a defined program, there's just so many elements in the city that can fight back. I think we have to have the council define what they want on a minimum basis, which includes how many employees are going to be downtown, how many employees are going to be out in the suburbs someplace, and make this thing work, including a civic theater and all the things that we need as a committee to come to a consensus as to what we think as a minimum should be on the site. And that includes a minimum number of housing units, because it's important that we try to comply with the Surplus Land Act. But if you don't do that, I just think you leave too much imagination to developers and just an incredibly extensive negotiation process with all the multiple city departments and a city attorney's office that really doesn't want to move faster than a snail. Okay?
Okay.
Thanks, Jack. And our final comment to Bridget.
Hello, everyone. I just kind of want to get on the tail of what Mike Zucchet and Jack talked about. I think we need a little bit more information as far as how things are going to go forward with the employees. I know it's kind of hard right now, but we also, as a committee, want to work in the best interest of the residents and the city of San Diego. We don't want to sell land that, that we could keep and then find out, we don't have what we need. It's important. I think we need more information.
Thank you, Bridget. Certainly some things to contemplate, Jay. You're hearing back.
I'm hearing the comments. I appreciate them for sure. And they're not falling on deaf ears.
Okay, well, we have more meetings, so I'm sure we'll hear more. Well, that concludes this item, and no motion is required as this is a discussion item only. We'll now take up committee member comment. Is there any further committee member comment?
Jamie, I think you may want to schedule an hour and a half for these meetings. At least
You
for a
know,
while.
I was a little confused. I saw Mike's comment in the chat if they were 1 hour or 2 hours, but it looked like they're 2 hours. Are we? Okay.
They're scheduled for 2 hours just in case.
Oh, okay.
Last time we did just 1, so we try to stay within the 1 and 2 hour range.
So that was my mistake. I certainly don't want to end any valuable committee comment. So I am here to stay through whatever time I need to be here. Is there any other committee comment? And again, I just reiterate, if there's anything that, any presentation or feedback you would like to see at this committee that I didn't already mention at the beginning, please let me know. And I'll go to Mike Zucchet.
Sorry, I'm talking too much today, but I'll be better in the future. So I guess I'm just trying to understand what this committee's final product might look like. If we're canceling the next meeting in favor of the good stuff, the tour and the city council. And I mean, the calendars just get short, and, you know, I just don't know. I'm trying to work backwards from what the end game with this committee is, and I'm having trouble envisioning that. And maybe that's for this committee to figure out. Maybe Jamie, you already know it. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there, that I'm trying to figure out where we're headed here.
Well, ideally, I would like only one presentation per committee, so we have enough time for feedback. I know Chris is compiling our comments for a final report to present to us to have discussion on, and then possibly refine it and then bring it back. I don't know, Jay, if you want to add to that.
No, I mean, I guess other than, I mean, ultimately, and I sort of was trying to imply this at the last meeting, is if you had a blank slate, if there weren't any surplus land act, and we had these 6 blocks and or some other non-contiguous parcels that we want to redevelop, what would this committee, along with some other public input, want to see here? Clearly, whether it's a brand new city hall, whether it's, you know, new civic theater, other kinds of things, maybe this becomes an entertainment center type. Those are the kinds of things I think the city was maybe looking for from this committee. Whatever this committee comes up with, I have no problems, and I think as a process standpoint, we would present some of these things to HCD to say, can we include X, Y, and Z in this redevelopment? Or the committee might say, you know, that Surplus Land Act is too restrictive, and all these projects we want are public related type projects. Maybe we don't go through the Surplus Land Act. Maybe this becomes a public works project. I'm not suggesting that, but I mean, but if the committee thought that was a better way of going, then obviously those are some of the things. You know, what would you like to see here? If it's a city hall and all housing based on all input, then that becomes, you know, what would come out of this committee. Just hopefully thinking outside the box. But again, at the end of the day, whatever this committee comes up with as ideas for what a redevelopment of this area might look like, we've got to get buy-off from HCD. I don't know how restrictive or confining they will be, or flexible, but we can bring HCD back to this committee. I mean, I can have those discussions with them, or we can bring them back. Here's what the committee wants to propose. What's your reaction, even maybe before a final report comes out? All of that's possible.
So we're not writing the NOA, we're making recommendations to the city for what should be included in the NOA that'll be run by HCD or fleshed out by HCD. And I'm just getting through the process, and then who makes the final decision on based on our input? Is that the mayor, the city council?
The mayor and the city council will make the final decision. Obviously, if this committee, for an example, says all 6 blocks should be in the NOA, don't carve out anything, everything should be razed to the ground and rebuilt. Obviously, I think the city council is going to listen carefully to that. And we would build that into the NOA. Then, of course, if everything got razed to the ground, what would this committee suggest replace it? There's 1 or 2 buildings, possibly, for sure, maybe 3 that we already have in mind, but there could be other ideas, and that's where HCD does have the ultimate authority to say yes or no, you can include it or not.
Maybe we should give them alternatives, Jay.
We can. And I'll tell you, anything that includes housing and affordable housing, they're not going to say no to. If somebody, because I heard somebody say maybe we put a minimum number of housing units on there. You know, HCD is not going to say no to something like that. It's if anything else gets suggested that may take away from the ability to put housing. But to your idea, Jack, you know, maybe it is come up with 2 or 3 alternatives, whatever number, and those get run past HCD.
Well, I'm all in for raising everything and rebuilding, because It looks like crap down there. I mean, you can't have a hodgepodge of old buildings with an unlimited budget to rehab and some new buildings. I mean, this is a unique opportunity for us in this city, in this quadrant of downtown, to really make a difference.
Mike, did you have anything further?
No, other than I understand what we're not doing here in the process after us. I'm worried about us. And I guess what I'm hearing is, at least as it's envisioned now, the mayor's staff is taking notes and is going to compile those into a report. That doesn't seem to cut it in terms of this charge of visioning. And our next meeting of substance is going to be early November. Then there's Thanksgiving. I just don't know how this is going to go. And I'm not trying to, get into subcommittees or whatever, but I don't know how 25 people on Zoom are going to do this in a few meetings over the next couple of months. I'm not trying to be harsh. I'm not being critical. You mentioned earlier, Jamie, about, only scheduling one presentation. I get all that. I'm just fundamentally, I just don't know how we're going to get to this report, which is being asked for when this committee was envisioned.
If I might add one other thing, though, while we've identified a timeline, and I was saying that we probably sometime right after the first of the year declare certain parcels surplus, and then by, let's say, March, issue the NOA. If this committee needs some more time, 2-3 more meetings, whatever, to flush out what they want to present, and this kicks over to, let's say, in April, there's nothing from a legal standpoint that dictates our timeline. We want a good process and give you the time you feel you need, so that when a report does get issued, you're comfortable standing behind it and not saying, well, it's all we could do because we only had 3 meetings. So I want to throw it out there. Everybody within the city, I'm talking about the elected officials, want this done yesterday. They don't want 101 Ave sitting there vacant indefinitely. But we're going through a process. We want to make sure that it's a productive process. And so I don't want you to feel, other than now I'm committing more time of yours and more time of Jamie's, but I don't want you to think that if you need another meeting, 2 meetings, 3 meetings, that you don't have it.
Yeah, if I could add, Jay, we, at our action item last meeting, we had the right to either adjourn meetings, call special meetings, extend the timeline beyond the December deadline that we gave ourselves. And then besides the meeting quantity, the number of meetings that we have, we as a committee can also discuss what we want our deliverable to be, whether it be a report, whether it be event in the community, whatever the committee comes up with. I think we're certainly open to having some sort of discussion item in the near future, even the next meeting, to talk about what that deliverable will look like from us.
Lori?
I know we all have time constraints, but 24 years ago, I was sitting where Betsy Brennan is as head of the Downtown Partnership. And it was in 96, 97 that Larry Lucchino, John Moores, Charles Steinberg, and a number of you here, we did Petco Park, and we did it right. And but for a lawsuit by Bruce Henderson, we would have had our first ball game 3 years before we kicked it off, hit it off, whatever it is, in 04. This is that kind of opportunity. This is it. For those of you who know, and I know Jay does and Jack, I have been talking about this project, that it would potentially, not anymore, include Horton Plaza, all of it. There is so much opportunity here to create the kind of housing we want, the kind of arts we want, a 21st century incredible, and with a Jennifer Luce, who is one of the finest that we have, not only in America, but internationally, to be thinking about this. And if it takes a few more months, fine. What I think is important is, how do we get the community engagement? That's what made Petco. People said, which I thought was weird, I want to eat sushi at the ballpark. Well, shit, there's sushi now at Petco Park. People participated. They wanted a theme. that was San Diego. They didn't want, the Red Sox. They didn't want the Yankees. They didn't want any of the other teams. They wanted it to be San Diego Padres. So how do we, in a vision and in a mission, this committee create the opportunity for the city, for this mayor, to project who we are in the 21st century? To me, that's what this project is about. And Michael, we can get caught up in all the little processes. In my opinion, that's staff. This is a visionary committee. These are people who have worked on projects before I was born. There are people here who've done amazing things. If we start getting into the nitty-gritty of all of it, before we begin to create that which we envision, it won't get done because it hasn't gotten done for 25 years. So please, my late husband sat on a committee like this in 1997 through 2000. He didn't live to see me now sitting on a committee for the same friggin' project. So whatever we do, y'all, let's do it right. Let's do it right. It might take a little bit more time, but we've got great leadership here, some of the best that San Diego has to offer. That's it.
Well, I think as a committee, we need to agree upon what it is we want our deliverable to be. And if that's a set of recommendations to the city, I shouldn't have called it a report, then that's great. If it's something more, that is also great. So I just encourage you all to think about that and share what that deliverable, what you expect that deliverable will be, because I too, want this to be successful and helpful to the city. I certainly don't want to spend 2 hours every other week and not have something worthwhile. And again, I'm willing to do more if needed. Is there any other committee member comment?
Jay, can you send us those 2 charts on the office space and the needs downtown?
Absolutely.
That'd be great.
Like we have one more, Stephen Russell.
I just want to say thank you, Laurie, for saying that so well and speaking from your heart and on behalf of many of us. Thank you.
Thank you. And on that note, we will now take a non-agenda public comment.
Non-agenda public comment is an opportunity for members of the public to comment on items that are not on the agenda, but within the subject matter jurisdiction of the committee. Each speaker will have 2 minutes. The public comment period for non-agenda public comment is now open. If you have already joined the Zoom webinar online or by phone, please raise your hand if you wish to speak. We have one speaker, Mr. Chuck Kaminsky.
Yes, I assume you can hear me. Thank you. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'll be really brief because I know everybody wants to go home. The dates that were read by the chair at the beginning of the meeting, will they be posted someplace if there's been changes? Is the first question. Is the tour going to be considered an official meeting, and can public attend that tour? That's the second question. The third is I submitted a letter consisting of 11 points. That's considered public communication. Is that posted somewhere, or is all public communication available to be read and seen on either the website or someplace else? Although I believe Mr. McGorry is very passionate about tearing everything down, I do think the city should still do its due diligence about, can any of those buildings be retrofitted floor plate wise for housing, et cetera. Ultimately, it will be torn down, but I think in honesty, transparency, and due diligence is important, so we don't just say let's do it because we like it. And the last is I really appreciate Ms. Black's comments, because we are creating a new neighborhood here, and the neighborhood is part of the organism of the city. And so I think the idea of what do we want this to be in the 21st to the 22nd century, because it'll be 60 years and it'll be 2080. It's a neighborhood, and I think we should maximize housing and make it as diverse as possible. This is the opportunity for diversity, community, and neighborhood in what has been a business, financial, government core. And I think we can set the trend. So thank you for that.
And that concludes public comment.
We do have a website that has the list of our meetings on there, and I expect that those, if anything changes, that will be updated.
Correct. Yeah, if there's any special meetings or adjournments, that agenda technically will still be posted online and sent to everyone that has subscribed to email updates. In terms of the public being invited to the tour, yes, I don't think it will technically be a public meeting. We can check with the city attorney's office, but everyone is welcome to attend. And then in terms of the letter that you sent, Chuck, I do have it here printed. We can also make that available online on the website.
Thank you, Chris. And I know we have limited meetings, so I really don't want to adjourn one, but I just feel like after trying to get city council and us to mesh our schedules, it seems this would be the most efficient and meaningful way to attend their already regular scheduled meeting on this very topic. So again, that is why I was recommending to adjourn the next meeting and also allow for that tour for those who want to do a walking tour. And with that, I'll adjourn this. That concludes non-agenda public comment, and we'll now adjourn this committee meeting to the next meeting on Monday, October 31st. And I hope to see you all either virtually or in person at City Council on October 17th at 2 p.m.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you.